सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Just how well is India's economy doing? We know there is a lot of talk, celebration of the fact that India has become the 5th largest economy by total GDP in the world, leaving United Kingdom behind. Also optimism, and I would say reasonable optimism, that by 2028, we will be the 3rd largest economy in the world. In fact, the Prime Minister said so in his address to the joint session to the US Congress. He said, when I came here the first time, India was the world's 10th largest economy by GDP. Now India is the 5th largest economy by GDP, and soon enough, India will be the 3rd largest economy. That claim is correct. That claim is not exaggerated. India will be the 3rd largest economy in the world, if not earlier, then definitely 2028, or so it seems. Now, if you look at the picture or the figures underneath this, one, yes, there is a cause for celebration from number 10 to number 5. In fact, we were even way behind, further behind. So it took some doing to get to number 10 to number 5, and we'll get to number 3. That's fantastic. But what is the reality behind it? Because the reality behind it has to be also seen in comparative terms. And what are our comparisons? All right. America is a notional comparison because America is the leading economic power of the world, right? America is also the magnet for talent and capital from all over the world. It prints the world's reserve currency, etc., etc. So maybe that comparison is not so apt. But look at the comparison with our peers and with our neighbor. And the neighbor that matters, the neighbor called China. So India and China are in competition. We want to believe that. The Chinese, on the other hand, argue that they've left India way behind and we are no longer competition. But you know, in India, we see ourselves as competition to China, not just financially, not just economically, but also morally, principally, politically, because we are a democracy, China is not. Also spiritually, right? Those are the beliefs that we have, because we are not going to become subservient to China in any way. And we believe that our culture is rich, our entrepreneurship is rich, so we are competitors of China. So if you look at those competitive figures, that is what becomes a very rude reality check. I might have been reflecting on these thoughts for some time, but it really got sparked. Today's episode of Cut The Clutter got sparked by an article that Subhash Chandra Garg, our former Secretary Economic Affairs, who was then transferred to Power Ministry and then took retirement from the government, he wrote in his article in a column for Deccan Herald. I'm sharing that column with you. You will also see the pages of the column on your screen as well. Now, in that column, he is given a very tough reality check to our sense of celebration. And he says, while you might say that your economy has grown, the fact is that the gap between you, that is between us, India, the gap between us and China and us and America is actually widening as our economy is growing. So as our economy is growing, creditable as it is, the gap between us and China is not narrowing. Us and America, I again said that is notional because we don't really compete with America. But the gap between us and America as well as China, but more significant for us with China, is increasing even as our economy keeps growing at a fast pace. Now, first of all, see what is it that we should feel happy about. We should feel happy about the fact that our economy has grown much faster than it might have done in the past, in the pre-reform past. So after reform in India, our economy has really taken off. And you can see this graphic that shows you how our economy has taken off, say from 1991 onwards. If you go back even to 2003-4, that's the year in which Vajpayee government handed over the reins of the economy and the country to UPA government under Dr. Manmohan Singh. Then India's economy was $0.52 trillion. everything is in current dollar values, $0.52 trillion. That is $500 billion. Today, this year already, in financial year 22-23, there will be some confusion as I go along. So let me clarify it right now. When I say IMF's projections, those reckon a year as calendar year. When we look at India, in India we see things in terms of financial year, which is 1st April to 31st March. IMF, on the other hand, will see it as calendar year, that is 1st January to 31st December. That clarification out of the way. 0.52 trillion in 2003-4. Then it goes up. In 10 years after that, when Manmohan Singh government hands over to Modi government, then the size of India's economy has gone to $1.8 trillion. That $1.8 trillion has now become $3.39 trillion. So you can see how this has gone up. And IMF projection is that this year, that is 2023, by the end of this year, India's economy would be $3.75 trillion, right? So $3.75 trillion, very good growth. Again, beginning at $0.52 trillion in 2003-4. So if you look at Mr. Garg's article, he tells you that if you go back to 2003-4, from there until 2013-14, India's growth rate was actually 13.59%. That is the growth rate on a compounded basis, or CAGR as it's called, compounded annual growth rate, right? So India's economy has continued to grow, and even after that, India's economy has grown. Now you might say that, look, it was 13.59 earlier, now it's been 5.99% in current dollar terms after the Modi government took over in the 9 years. But the fact also is that as the base rises, percentages come down. Remember, whenever we look at data, we make the same disclaimer. We always have the same word of caution that always look at the absolutes, the base, and the percentages. So as the base goes up, as the absolute goes up, percentages come down. So keep that in mind. Now that is good. That is good because India's economy has grown. But what has happened to India, or what has happened to other economies, which we might see as competition? Yet again, let me say for the fifth time, maybe we should not see America as competition, although I see in our breathless debate sometimes that, oh, by such and such year, India will leave America behind. So I do hope it happens, and I do hope I live long enough for that to happen in my lifetime. But let's leave it aside for a moment. Let us see what has happened to India in comparison to China. I'll add America also in these years as India has grown. So once again, I am going back to Mr. Garg's article because he points out that in 1999-2000, that is at the turn of the century, the size of the global economy was $34 trillion. All this data is from IMF. It was $34 trillion. In 2022, the size of the global economy became $100 trillion. So in 20 years, the global economy tripled in its size, right? 3 times increase in 20 years. Fantastic. The world really grew in those two decades. What happened to US, China, and India in the same period? If you look at the data up to 2019, we are deliberately choosing 2019 because that's the pre-pandemic year. Because after that, the pandemic abnormalities came in. So in 2019, the size of the global economy was $87 trillion, of which the US had $21.38 trillion. China was $14.34 trillion and India was $2.84 trillion. Everything is reckoned in current dollars. So you are comparing mangoes with mangoes. I'm just Indianizing apples for apples comparison. So mangoes for mangoes comparison. Now, if you look at 2022, the US economy, again in current dollar terms, has gone up to $25.46 trillion. China has gone up to $18.1 trillion and India has gone up to $3.39 trillion. So while India's economy has grown, which is fantastic, the gap between India and China and India and America has actually grown. So even as you can see this graphic now, and this graphic will move. As this graphic moves, you will see that India's economy is going up like this. Chinese economy is going up like this. And the American economy, already high, is going up like this. So America is obviously higher than China, but the gap between only focus on India and China. So even as India is growing, gap between India and China is growing very fast and very steeply. And that is something, that's a reality check that we have to keep in mind when we get into our sort of paroxysms of celebration, because we are doing great when compared to our own past, but we are not necessarily doing that much better compared to our peers. We are doing well, but the peers are doing well also, and because they've built a high base already, they are actually able to increase the gap between them and us. If you look at the 2022 figures, America at 25.46 trillion and China at 18.1. So respectively, the first has $22.07 trillion more than us in the size of its economy. We are 3.39, they are 25.46, so they are ahead by 22.07. These are not percentages, these are absolute numbers. The Chinese, on the other hand, are at 18.1, we are 3.39, so Chinese are ahead of us by $14.71 trillion. Now, how has this gap been widening? Because we'd like to believe that India is growing very fast and maybe China every year hasn't grown this fast. So why is this gap widening so much? So one, of course, we had a very negative pandemic year, the year of the lockdown, when we had negative growth. China did not quite have a negative growth, definitely did not have a setback of that size because China did not carry out a nationwide lockdown. But the fact is that unlike Indian rupee, which keeps depreciating, so the Indian rupee on December 31, 2019 was 69 to a dollar. 69 rupees to a dollar, now it's about 82, 83. So Indian rupee has declined or weakened by about 20% in these 4 years to the dollar. And that affects India's overall growth. Now, the Chinese yuan has not depreciated that much to the US dollar. In fact, US would prefer that the Chinese yuan strengthens compared to the US dollar because a weaker yuan helps Chinese exports and affects American exports into China. That's a different debate altogether. So because the Chinese yuan is not depreciated, their real growth in current dollar terms is 8.07%, whereas India's is 6.9% in the same period. That is why the gap is widening so steeply between India and China, because one, they have the base advantage because their base is already almost 5 times the size of our GDP, or where we started it was more than 5 times the size of our GDP. And second, their growth rate still continues to be higher. So if you want to play catch up, it will take a long time, but also to play catch up, we have to grow much faster than our current rate of growth. 6.9% is very healthy for India, but again, it is not catching up with China. The gap, if anything, is widening. So if you look at IMF projections, say for 2028, by that time, India is well past the $5 trillion mark and well on its way to becoming the third largest economy in the world, leaving Japan and Germany behind. At that point, India's economy would be $5.58 trillion. Our target has been, the Prime Minister gave the target of $5 trillion economy. You will get to 5.58 by 2028. At the same time, the same IMF projection tells us what the size of the Chinese economy will be and American economy will be. See how this chart moves, how this graphic moves. You see Indian economy moving like this, Chinese like this, and the American then like this. Again, if you want to see in absolute terms, you can see the graphic and you can see that the gap between India and China is increasing. Gap between India and America is increasing even more. It is the Chinese who are sort of closing the gap with the Americans, right? Not as rapidly as they might want to, but they are closing the gap with the Americans. We are not. So if you look at absolute numbers at $5.58 trillion economy in 2028, the Chinese will be $27.49 trillion. The Americans will be $32.35 trillion. That means in terms of the size of their total economy, Chinese will be about $22 trillion more than us. 21.91 trillion, let's round off, $22 trillion more than us. Today they are $14.71 trillion more than us. So if you are confused by percentages, if you are confused by what you see visually, the gap, the increasing gap between the two lines, the India growth line and the China growth line, I'm also giving you the absolute figure. And similarly with America, the gap in 2022 was 22.07 trillion. Let's round it off, say 22 trillion. It will go up to 26.77 trillion. So once again, for India to catch up, India has to grow much faster. The other thing we see in the direction of self-congratulation, and self-congratulation, we should not always be judgmental about self-congratulation. It's also good. It ups our morale. It's just that we must keep it in perspective. And this episode of Cut The Clutter with this data is about getting the perspective sorted. So if you see, for example, per capita incomes in the world, 10 largest economies in 2028 as projected by the same IMF data. If you look at the IMF data, by 2028, India will be well on its way to becoming the third largest economy in the world if it doesn't already do so. Definitely by 2030, India will be the third largest economy in the world. Now that is also the size of India's population and size of India's economy, right? Because everything in India, the basic figure or the absolute figures are affected by the number of people you have. But when you divide the size of an economy by the number of people you have, then you get per capita incomes, and that tells you how rich or poor you are. So in fact, if you look at IMF data, we don't even have to wait till 2028. In 2027 itself, we'll become the third largest economy in the world, leaving Japan and Germany behind, right? Again, there'll be celebration and we should celebrate. That's a big thing. But the size of your economy, the size of any absolute numbers is also a function of your population. So we will be larger than Japan and Germany, but with a much, much larger population. So once again, a reality check. It's not to puncture our own balloon, but we must look at the facts. The fact is that even in 2028, when we are the third largest economy by some distance, having left Japan and Germany behind, our per capita income will be $3,720, whereas that of the US at that point would be 93,000 plus. China, our peer, China will be 19,600. So again, almost 5.5 times larger than India. So the average Chinese in 2028, when we are the third largest economy, will be about 5.5 times richer than us. Now, that said, that's a reality check. Sounds rude. At the same time, we should also feel good about the fact that at $3,700 per capita income, we'll be like a low middle income country. And while at $2,600, already India looks in pretty good shape, and we can compare ourselves with a lot of our other neighbors, with a lot of other developing countries and say, look, we are doing so much better. You can imagine at $3,700 plus per capita income, we will look that much better. So we will be much less poor. We will be the third largest economy and growing at a healthy clip. But that does not mean that we'll be closing the gap between us and the Chinese, our main rivals, or for that matter, the Americans. That gap will continue growing. To close that gap, India has to make policy changes and do whatever it takes to get its growth rate in the double figures and keep it like that for maybe 3-4 decades from now on. Otherwise, there'll be no catching up because the lead the Chinese have taken already is quite massive. That said, before I let you go, I know that these comparisons don't work anymore because India, Pakistan, I don't even see why we should compare the two countries. But the fact is that until 1985-6, Pakistan had a higher per capita income than India's, almost 65% higher per capita income than India's. See also, because we are comparing ourselves with our peers and our rivals in our neighborhood, so China is a rival, Pakistan is a rival too. Although Pakistan's been diminishing in its political, strategic and economic power globally. So once again, if you see how the GDPs of the two countries are moving, you can see that India is widening the gap with the Pakistanis now much faster. Look at how India's graph is going, and look at how Pakistan's is sort of looking quite pedestrian and going through many hiccups in the process. Now that is something that I've talked about in the past, that how come a country that was doing so much better than India economically, how did that country get left so badly behind? And that I ascribe to Pakistan choosing in the early 80s, when trouble started in our Punjab and later in Kashmir, Pakistan choosing in the early 80s the strategy of terrorism as an instrument of state policy, because they saw something like that working in Afghanistan, because they had become partners with the Americans in Afghanistan, and they thought, Zia's Pakistan thought, if they could do this to the Soviets in Afghanistan and do it to the great advantage, why couldn't they do this in India as well? That is something that the Pakistani economy has paid the price for, and that gap you can see in these graphics. In fact, if you look at the 3-year period between 2019 and 23, the US economy has added $4.08 trillion to its size. The Chinese economy has added $3.76 trillion to its size. And India has added $0.55 trillion to its size. I pick up this data from Mr. Garg's article. Now, what this tells us is that in these 4 years, both the US and the Chinese have added to their economy amounts or value that is more than all of India's economy. Forget the Americans again, look at the Chinese. The size of India's total economy now is $3.39 trillion. In these 4 years, they've added $3.76 trillion to their economy. So this is once again a tough reality check. I know that it sounds rude, it looks rude, but it's a reality. We should acknowledge it, understand it, and then take a deep breath and get down to accelerating our growth rate even further.